Buenas tardes. Los invitamos a tomar sus asientos para seguir con la siguiente conferencia magistral, la última de este día y, por supuesto, una de las mejores. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes tengan todos ustedes.
Good afternoon. We have our third and last keynote presentation in this fifth forum of Latin American democracy, organized jointly with the Organization of American States, with the Colegio de Mexico, with the Electoral Tribunal of the Judicial Branch of the Federation, with the Fondo Cultura Económica, Idea Internacional, and the National Electoral Institute. And it's my pleasure to introduce, as moderator of this session, the Mr. Benito Nasif, who is a board member of INE. Would you please take the floor over? Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you all, and thanks to all those who are with me in this Alfonso Reyes room in Colegio de Mexico, and thanks to all those who are following us in internet. Precisely the topic presented a while ago. Before I start, I would like to, of course, I would like to recognize and I would like to thank Colegio de Mexico, the National Institute, INE, the Organization of American States, the Tribunal, Justice Tribunal, Fondo de Cultura Económica, and Idea Internacional for the effort they've been making in the last 5 years to organize this type of fora. In this last session of today, we're going to have a keynote presentation, and I am very pleased to introduce, I would like to introduce Mr. Jose Miguel Insulza, General Secretary of the Organization of American States, and the title of this keynote presentation is Challenges of Democracy in Latin America. For many, many years, and in different perspectives, the Secretary has been concerned. He has always been attentive to the topic of the strengthening of democracy, and specifically in our region. As you can see in your resume, he has had prosecutorial assignments in Chile, and he has been also the General Secretary of the Organization of American States, and he has been consistent to challenges towards democracy in the region. For example, the coup d'etat in Honduras, the increase in Venezuela, Brazil, or the efforts of criminal national procedures, what happens in our country. And before his career in the public sector, he dedicated many, many years to teaching and to research. I would like to start this introduction retaking one of the phrases that the General Secretary has given in his recent expressions about democracy in Latin America. He has said democracy is healthiest than ever in the region. I fully agree. Many countries some years ago went through authoritarianism to democracy. There was always uncertainty, but today there are more or less 35 democratic nations in the region, 35 democratic regions, and this is the way of government that prevails, the one that is present across Latin America. It could be said that young democracies are more vulnerable to authoritarian regressions, specifically during the first years. But as time goes by, there is an interiorization of new ways of doing policy and of making policies, and democratic institutions become stronger. Most of the Latin American countries have successfully gone through that high-risk stage. But we should also remember that there are some levels of consolidation and democratic progress, and the existence of a democratic regime is not a dichotomic variable only. It is the quality of democracy, the depth of democracy. Those are also very relevant and important factors. I would like to say in this introduction to this topic that from my perspective, which is the perspective of a Mexican person who is now specialized in electoral management, essentially, I see two big risks and concerns relative to democracy in our region as well as in our country. First of all, I will say the problem of patronage. Patronage, I see this as a way of corruption, maybe the worst in democracy, because this is the corruption of the will of the voters. And through dependence on governmental programs, and because of the dependence condition in favor of voting in favor of some political parties, specifically the one that is in power today, there is less accountability, there is less elements to be healthy, and this corruption of the will of the voters. We should also have a second corruption problem in democracies, and specifically in the region, which is the corruption of the will of the representatives through organized groups, through factual powers. The second risk, I would like to make a short comment about, is the risk of the weakness of institutions. The risk of weakness of institutions and the needs that Mexican countries have and other Latin American countries have to preserve and reinforce institutional mechanisms. This is what Guillermo O'Donnell called horizontal accountability. The risk, the trend towards plebiscite democracy, plebiscite-based democracy that will then give rise to polarization of voters and concentration of power. These are two phenomena that will jeopardize the institutional frame, the scheme of breaks and counterweight and controls over the exercise of power, because this is very important in a liberal democracy. As the General Secretary said, today there is more democracy in Latin America, more than ever before. But the work is not over. Some countries show a better performance in the construction of democratic institutions, while others face a more tortuous pathway. Our speaker, Jose Miguel Insulza, is going to share his ideas about the challenges that young Latin American democracies face. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to sincerely thank our friends from INE and also the different institutions, Colegio de México, Idea Internacional, etc., for this invitation to give this lecture. This is my last year as General Secretary of the Organization of American States. I hope next year I can also be sitting and listening to the panelists. This is what I would love to do, to be with you listening. So I am very pleased to be here and to share some ideas. And I would like to say that this is an introduction that has to do with democracy. And this is the democracy such as it is today. And since this is a keynote, a presentation, I thought I was going to be standing in a podium and I thought I was going to be reading. So I will take my notes, but I will not necessarily be standing with a podium, but this is going to be a new style. So, correct. The first thing I should say is that Latin America has experienced in recent years very substantive changes, fundamental transformations economically and socially. Remember the last 10 years that were just over in the year 2012, and this is when this economic situation worsened, but how some countries grew during that time window with huge transformations, not only politically but also economically. And politically, I would say that, as others have said, for the last in the last 25 years, some of dictatorships have collapsed, and it was more or less 20 years ago when we came to a peace in Central America and the democratic regimes. And we're going to be later asking how democratic those regimes are. And this is the common denominator in the Americas. If we go beyond the criticism, and there are going to be many critics, but there are two continents in the Americas that could be called the democratic, which are the European and the American continents. And democracy is based on the fact that people will vote, people will elect. Is it enough? We do not know. But the legitimacy of the political process, it starts with the democratic elections, which are which are cleaner. They are also more competitive and more inclusive. And certainly there are many effects, and I will be speaking about those effects later. But the level of my organization, I've seen and I have observed elections in other countries, and those countries that we observe, they do not have the same quality as we do. So in comparative terms, we should never make comparisons. We should always compare ourselves with ourselves, because if we compare ourselves with the last 20 or 25 years, the situation happens to be very good. Now, democracy is also the achievement of conditions of values and rights, and among which we have the defense of human rights, freedom of speech. We also have respect of the rule of law, political pluralism, power balance, non-discrimination, promotion of human development, and social inclusion. These are all the different ultimate goals of the democratic process. In other words, we elect the authorities, and then we're going to take actions in politics for all these things to happen. And these are also what I just did is a way to come to consolidation of democracy. And democracy is not defined as an aspiration. You know that democracy till recently, according to the definitions of the Organization of the American States, when presidents wanted to stay in hotels where others will not stay, and they were asking for staying in different places where not all people were staying, and in those cases there were more dictators than those who were democratically elected. And in those meetings it was said that democracy was only an aspiration, the aspiration of all the Americas, but now it is recognized as it is recognized as a right. The Democratic Inter-American Chart says that the Latin American peoples have the right to democracy, and governments have the obligation to give democracy. We all know of the origin of this democratic consensus. But if I make reference to this sequence, what I am trying to do is to speak about the democratic chart, the Inter-American chart signed in September 11th of 2001. This is a known date. There was a meeting of chancellors, and they were the ones who signed this Inter-American Democracy Chart. But it is a program. It is a program of the Democratic Republic. It is the ideal, which is the inspiration, and it can also be improved. But in very practical terms, it is used to measure the gap there is, and I recognize there is a huge gap between the democratic aspirations and the current regional situation, in order to see how far away we have come to in this pathway towards democracy, because these are democracies, as I already said, these are democracies which are away from getting to perfection. Now, the experience, however, and As someone said before, the experience, the ups and downs we have seen in Latin America. And in democracy, we've seen that democratic development is not linear. I agree when people say that it is brittle in the first years, but the risk has always existed. Democracy is a process, and there is progress, and there is also backward, going back, and those are normal situations, things that happen once. But in other cases, we're speaking about real relationships of some fundamental elements of democracy. And this can be a very important risk for sustainability, and this is exactly what we should be worried about. Now, the first thing that I would like to do is to make an assessment of some of the traits or some of the characteristics. And here we have a lot of simplification. If you want to know how democracy works in America, you need to visit each one of the 35 countries and then make a description, generalization. Sometimes we need to make this generalization. The starting point is important and is positive. Authorities are elected through votes. But here we have political financing, and we'll be speaking about this later. And then patronage. The big difficulty there is to separate the legitimate political action of a government from the authority, from the generation of economic well-being. We also have the gender participation. It is a problem in many countries, and the participation of the minorities. All these are topics that are to be resolved, but we know that we are speaking about standing governments. Legitimacy or standing is going to come from opposition, and in our case, we do not have many cases where there is not a standing or there is not a legitimate government according to the opponents or the opposition. This is the first comment. The second comment is that we are now much more stable. The region can be better governed, and I will give you an example. Since 1990 to the year 2015, those 15 years, all the way to the year 2005. During those 15 years, the term was not, 18 Latin American governments didn't complete a term. 18 governments didn't finish the term because the president was fired, was replaced because of a coup d'etat. But I am not speaking about legitimate or non-legitimate reasons. I am only saying that 18 governments didn't finish the term. Let's do not think all governments failed. You know that in some places 4 or 5 governments failed or collapsed. But there was an important number of governments who didn't finish the mandate. And since the middle of 2005 till now, this has happened with only 2 governments. Honduras was a coup d'etat. In Paraguay, there were discrepancies. President Lugo and myself. Lugo, he was a victim of trial. And the Congress in Paraguay had the constitutional power to have that trial. So it was not a coup d'etat. So what matters the most is that in these countries, the people went back to democracy. And they were very different processes. We have a solid starting point, standing or legitimacy of origin, but it doesn't mean we have a strong governments. It doesn't mean we have solid governments that can do the work correctly, because this is something that has been affected. This strength has been affected because of the lack of resources, and because of the distance, and because of the lack of trust. The lack of trust by a very important number of citizens. And this is a contradiction in parentheses, because when I am told that we need to make a reform, when you say that you need to have a tax reform to increase the resources of the state and to be able to resolve all the problems, a lot of people say, how come that money is going to be spent? I do not trust the government. So we have these are problems that affect governments. And governments become weaker, the lack of resources and the lack of confidence, the citizens' distance. And I heard about this citizens' distance, and this has been a topic presented by some people. So I will not elaborate on this. What matters the most and what happens is that our governments are have to deal with problems such as poverty, unemployment, equality of opportunity, public security, and the electoral promises. These governments have to be responsible for topics such as security, social aspects, and sometimes it is not possible to comply with those requirements, and this is because of the lack of solid, reliable institutions capable of implementing the required policies. This is a difficulty that comes from the previous administration. Do not forget that Latin America lived under the concept that the state was part of the problem and it was not part of the solution. And this is what some neoliberal economists used to say. The state, as Ronald Reagan, is part of the problem. The state is not part of the solution. And in many of the countries, it happened here and it happened in my country. Public services were privatized, the budgets were reduced, and the effectiveness was damaged in education, in health, in public transportation. We had a collective transportation company. It was state-owned, and it was working reasonably well, but that stopped existing completely. The number of schools that were privatized was huge. Schools were first in the hands of the municipalities, and some municipalities that have money in excess to make it work, and others without the possibility to make it work. In other words, the reduction of services. In the previous term, it was huge, but today the demand is growing. There is democracy. And because there are some groups which are in conditions to ask for more than what the requirements were in the past, the demands of the middle sectors. And I will be speaking about this as well. There are more and more, and this is more than what we saw some years ago. The demands from the government are huge. And how this is also a paradox. As more people abandon the extreme poverty situation and exclusion situation they face, the more demands there are going to be from the state actions. So it is necessary to have an institutional reform to face these new realities, to cope with these new realities. This is essential for the strengthening of democracies in order to face a situation, a reality. It was something unfair, because inequality is not only inequality in terms of income distribution, and I'm speaking about the continent. If you see the numbers of the OECD, the numbers that show inequality will mention in the last three positions the United States and the two Latin American countries which are part of the Organization for Economic Development. Inequality can be compared with our situation. This is a hemispheric term. And the big question is, if these essential challenges that our democracies face today, inequality, lack of opportunities, social exclusion, discrimination of gender, discrimination of the minorities, and a growing situation. I think it was Monica, the one who spoke about this. From 55 to 70 million in the previous 10 years. People who came out of poverty. Distribution of income was not better. They didn't come out of poverty. They didn't come into the middle class overnight. There was a very interesting article by Dora Lusty. 1/3 of the Latin American population is not poor, but they live under the threshold and the economic situation that we're starting to see in some countries. The possibility of this happening again. Not even the possibility of going back. If the World Bank should do, if there is a 0.15 cent increase, if it increases by 0.15 cent, the daily income of households, it is going to be a lot of people going back to poverty. And this is a topic, this is a demand that our countries do not have the condition to solve. We have been speaking about violence as well. There is a big tragedy. This is the only one continent that hasn't had a war in the last 80 or 90 years. After the Chaco War, we haven't had any type of war, but we still have the highest violence rate, and it is very endemic violence, organized crime. We also have a threat against the democratic structure, common crime, the situation of violence, and it has also, and those sectors which are under less supervision. 5 out of every 6 police officers in Central America are private police officers. There is only 1 public police officer for every 5 private ones. This is discrimination, and these are the different topics that cannot be resolved by the market. Even if we grow, we need to have decisive actions by the governments. We need to have adequate state policies, and we need to strengthen the state in order to then adopt public policies and to create public services that will improve the condition of people in Latin America, people who still believe in democracy, but they hope governments will be able to make progress in the solution of needs. So it is not only a thing to be resolved with principles and values. The policy is also the result of concrete results. The public function management, it will depend on the attainment of specific and concrete results. Now, I also spoke about trust on citizens, and I do not want to speak about the causes of lack of trust, but as long as there is no trust, it will be difficult to speak about institutional aspects. How are we going to improve credibility? How are we going to come to transparency, higher levels, higher than the ones we currently have, despite of the important progress that some places have attained? So how can we show, how can we prove, how can we have a debate? How can we address all the different questions? How can we tell people whether or not the state can, or if it may, or if the world of politics wants to resolve problems? It is important to defend legitimacy or standing of the political processes. We do not want to only defend the political process or the factual things that happen. It is not only considering the groups of infiltrated people or criminals infiltrating the government. We want to guarantee equality for citizens' participation. We want to have equality, and we want to strengthen the actions by the state. We want people to trust what the government and on the actions by the state. And I believe transparency is very important for this. And I am making a reference to the political financing, which is vital for a democratic political system, healthy political system. This is something that we have seen many times in the 3rd Summit of the Americas. There was information about the high cost, the need to have a transparent regime. A big effort has been done in all the countries, but in some countries there has been also some return to the past. A clear example is the one I remember when the first laws were issued in Latin America, and the U.S. laws were used as a model in terms of financing the campaigns, the limits, how much in donations, how private campaigns are, and the U.S. Supreme Court erased all that. And this is going back in the largest country in the continent where money flows freely. And there are no limits, not only in terms of what people cannot spend in their campaigns, but also in terms of what they can get. Candidates in the previous elections, there were no limits, and they rejected private financing. No, sorry, public. The speaker corrects himself. In the past, there was public financing, and they rejected this public financing, and in this way, they now have free hands to get money from wherever. Now, we have the reports of our office, and in all countries we see, and we observe this in almost all countries, there are huge gaps in the regulation of political parties and electoral financing systems. And the conclusion of our observers is that this will affect equity and transparency of the electoral processes, and it is necessary to control private financing in politics, in the use of private funds, and this is to improve the equality in political actions and to have legal mechanisms to level the floor in order to allow candidates to compete in relatively the same conditions. And with this, we need to have public financing necessarily. So we're speaking about a stable, strong government as a condition for democracy. And this is where a big effort has been done. The same can happen in this decade. It is complicated. It is a complicated topic. I do not know if you saw the report of the International Monetary Fund 2 days ago. 4 months ago, we were in an alarm when the fund and the bank met in last June or May, and the numbers for Latin America were horrible. 2.2%. This was the growth for this year. And here it is going to be 1.2%. So the drop in the economies in the strong regions, and this is a problem that will limit many of the things done in terms of social services, income distribution, fight against crime, because there are not enough resources for that. But it doesn't mean we don't have to make a big effort to keep on strengthening the relationship between citizens, politics, and to make governments effective as possible. And here I come to a very interesting point. Here we are speaking about transparency, efficiency, and all this takes us to accountability, and some authors stop looking for a better translation. Guillermo Gomer, the one I will be making reference to, he says that we should use the word accountability, because it is not only a regular accountability, it's not only the account term. All the authorities in a democratic system should respond to someone for the things they do or the things they do not do, and it is a bigger concept. We use the term accountability, unlike because there is no other concept to be used, but it refers to something much more complex. Now, behind accountability, we have the exercise of power in democracy. There are limits to it. This, to me, is something palpable, is something visible. the philosophy. If, for example, if you read the founders of the Latin American democracy, and if you read all these writings, they were very pessimistic in terms of their performance and behaviors of governors, and they justify most of the limits they have to stick to because they are convinced that if those limits are not imposed, it could be a violation, a transgression. Power should never be exercised in an absolute matter, because if this is the reality, the personal leadership, even if there are favorable votes from the majority, at the end of the day, this will substitute people's will. The history of our region is full of governors. And once they had access to power, they were there in their mandates. And these are all very valid concepts, but at the end of the day, this is a destruction of the democracy that gave a rise to them. In democracy, I always say that all powers should be responsible to others and to other members of the system. And for this, there is the separation of public powers. We have the autonomy of the judicial branch and the freedom of speech. Supervision organizations and entities of the civil society. And as O'Donnell says, those are the things that we see in our current democracies, and those are the things that seem to be more uncomfortable. O'Donnell started, as we know, he said he dedicated his life to democracy, first to the lack of democracy when he was speaking about the authoritarian democratic governments, and then the transition, the democratic transition. He was fascinated by it. It is one of his words, and in his recent works, more critical works, and his big criticism was this. He used to say, and I will not quote him, but I will try to repeat what he said. In our governors, there was some aversion. There was they didn't want to accept accountability as one of the necessary democratic characteristics. I do not know it by heart. I do not have very good memory, but I am trying to remember what he said. Many of the new governors believe that by having votes, the limits of the system are now more obstacles that they have to overcome, rather than essential democratic characteristics. So the issue is not how to strengthen freedom of speech, or how am I going to strengthen the non-governmental organizations, how am I going to strengthen the independence of the judicial branch. It is rather, how am I going to meet my objectives, overcoming all these hindrances that have been imposed by the democratic legislation. And I believe this is a very fundamental defect that we have. I don't believe this is an epidemic situation in the region. I don't think this is the reality. I believe there are many countries that, if we go beyond how impatient some governors are, but I believe these accountability factors, responsibility factors are still there. But let's recognize that in recent years we have had situations at times of subordination of one power from another, limitation of the independence of the judicial branch, of the electoral power, restrictions to freedom of speech. It is not only from the government, it also comes from the concentration of the media or the press and organized crime, limitation to the actions by the civil organization, undue intervention in electoral processes, and all this is a risk of having a democratic return to the past. There are very important reasons in our history. We are forced to speak about the need for limits in the democratic exercise and the accountability. It is a must, as I already said. We have a history of caudillos. Let's recognize it. So we need to be scrupulous, more scrupulous, that those regions that do not have it, the substitution of the power of institutions for the power of individuals. This was something that we unfortunately saw for many years in our political process, and despite of the importance of the reasons, indispensable leadership in completed tasks. General de Gaulle once said, he said, the cemeteries are full of indispensable people. No one is indispensable. In other words, personal power unipersonal power and the prevalence of one state on top of others, even if there is a democratic creation. Zacharias said it during the 90s. And many of these phenomena happens in those democratically elected governments, and these are the measures taken with the ratification of the elected congresses. But let's recognize that this type of measure will delay the construction of democratic public institutions. Democratic systems characterized by the strength of their institutions, separate and autonomous ones, the accumulation of power in one or some charges without accountability, without limits in the exercise. This is opposite to the strength of the democratic republic, where all the citizens should be necessary, but no one should be indispensable. Now, I believe that the size of these challenges, and this is going to be the end of my presentation, and the magnitude of the challenges that come from the society need strong democratic governments and the construction of institutions that will give this force. All this is an important obstacle. Now, the main problem that many countries face, many countries that have the need to be transformed significantly, is a huge division among the different sectors of the society. Building institutions for the type of problem we face, we need to have an ample political dialogue, transparent and with the participation between the political forces and the social players. We need to have long-term governance agreements. And we see with concern that in some countries that need for a dialogue is being replaced by the confrontation, and it is not possible to resolve problems. I would like to end by saying that the national agreements cannot be reached and will not be reached every day, because this is the only moment where there is a frame in which there is policy and discrepancies without jeopardizing stability of government. Many of our countries need that. We're in a democratic process. There are many inequalities in the different countries. It is something we need to be subject to the rules of transparency, the accountability that we need to have in all democracies. Thank you very much for your attention. Here we have only we have a 10-minute notice and many questions, and there are two types of questions. You are being recognized as the General Secretary, and you are asked about the future of the Organization of American States and other questions relative to the Latin American democracy, which happens to be the topic of this conference. So I apologize. So I will focus on questions relative to the topic of this forum. In Mexico, we say that the ones who make the law are the ones who make the trap. Yes. Here we have a question, and it has to do with this thing about constructing democracies. If it is political parties the ones and that make democracies, can we be optimistic about the strengthening of democracy? Because they do this in Congress. The relationship between democracy and economic growth. Is there any relationship between standing of democratic governments and their capacity, their financial capacity to address the needs and the demands of the population, specifically the needs of poor people? Because this is one of the permanent topics relative to the future of democracy in Latin America. The surveys of the Latin Barometer, specifically in cases like Mexico, when they have to choose between prosperity and democracy, there is a majoritarian public opinion in countries like Mexico who want to have prosperity regardless of the type of government. This is a concern. People wanted to have prosperity. They also ask for your opinion on how to incite from the outside in order to promote inside of the nations, in nations such as Haiti, consolidation of democracy. What do you think about interventions to promote stability and to promote democracy? And there is another question that relates democracy and the acts of the Organization of American States. What about Latin American processes if they are observers? What is the role of the Organization of American States in these processes? And since we do not have time to mention all of them, I will try to remember all your questions. If I forget something, please remind me. First of all, I would like to something that I repeated, and this is a very important information. The law is created and the trap is created. Yes, of course, I remember that when we enacted the law for electoral financing in Chile, I said it will last 10 years and only 3 or 4 elections, and they were going to find a way to skip it or to bypass it. That was the reality. At that moment, I was interested in public financing, and there was no way to finance electoral campaigns. But starting a legislative process over something that doesn't exist allows us to resolve the traps, for example, and then to make it perfect. If you wait till having all the different spaces properly covered before enacting a law, then the enactment will not happen. I remember in Chile there were many different reasons. I remember once I was in the Carter seminar, in a Carter Center seminar, and people were asking about financing laws, and I told them how ours worked, and they told me that type of financing didn't work in our case. So learning is complicated, but I believe at the end of the day, with the willingness to do it, to make it happen, it is possible. And I want to believe that most of the countries want to come to reforms. They want to make reforms. And there are other countries, and there are some countries where the majority of the people are voluntarily immersed in a process of lack of transparency. But I don't think this is happening in my country, and I want to be honest with you, and I do agree with him. If it is the politicians, the ones creating the laws, so I believe it is possible to change the system in terms of transparency, because the world of politics also responds to the citizens' will. I believe the demand for transparency, the world of politics to respond for the things they do. Let's recognize it. 30 years ago, it was not an issue in our emerging democracies, but today this is an issue. Democracy is progressive, and the demand, there is going to be always demand for this. I don't think a democracy is going to be imposed from outside. I've never believed it. I haven't seen cases where the army has come to implement democracy. If you read, I recommend you to read the new book by Mr. Kissinger, and it is not only the book, it is a comment by the director of The Economist, and he is quoting some phrases. To make this comment, he was quoting some phrases used in the United States for the case of Iraq and Afghanistan. And he said, look, it happens to be that in Afghanistan, this is a country where the rights of women do not exist, and the tribal wars still persist significantly. But then we say that we're going to create a tolerant democracy based on gender equality and within the frame of peace. You can say many things in paper, but the reality is the one known by the citizens in each country. It can help as long as there is goodwill. People can support and many things can be said. But unfortunately, if there is no democratic will to build a democracy and will to come to an agreement, and I believe this is what happened to Venezuela. In Venezuela, there is no will to come to an agreement. There is no will to come to an agreement, with the exception, I believe, some reduced groups of people who are not the majority. If there is no will to come to an agreement, no one will make this agreement possible. And it would be good to see if, for example, you have cases to share with us. We could have externally assisted democracy, but I don't think it is possible. International organizations are not supranational organizations. They will not come on top of the country's will. The founder of the Organization of American States says, this organization will only, all the countries will be what they want to be, and I believe those member countries want to be something different, because problems have changed. When there was this great policy of the human rights during the 70s and during the 80s, no one in Latin America was interested in the United States signing but not ratifying the convention. But today this is very important, because there is democracy and because there is a policy of human rights that is now valid. But at that time, there was less demand for this. They only wanted not people to be killed in those countries. So what I am trying to say is that we need to have democracy making progress. We know that there are many flaws and we can complain, but at the end of the day, we should be in the right pathway. My concern is this trend to replace personal institutions for personal leadership, and I believe this is a risk we're going to take for a long time, and we should not accept. Democracy has limits, because if you are elected, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to do. You are re-elected, but you need to talk to the general comptrollership, you need to talk to the National Congress, you need to talk to justice tribunals, we need to talk to the media, we need to talk to the social media, we need to talk to non-governmental organizations. Those are the game rules of democracy. Those are not hindrances. We need to strengthen all this. We need to strengthen the judiciary. We want prosecutors to perform better, comptrollership to come to the root cause. We want transparency. Is there going to be a problem for governors? Yes, but these are the rules of the democratic game. The other day, a president, for the first time, a president of a European country, spoke about the words by Farin Zakaria. He wrote this called The Rise of Illiberal Democracies, and this is something terrible. This is something terrible. The rise of the illiberal democracy, and he defined his government as an illiberal democracy, and he was very proud. There may be others, but those are the rules. How to work in countries such as Haiti and others. I will give you an elliptic response. We haven't been able to make elections in Haiti this year because there is no consensus to come to an elections. So we have the Organization of American States, the president who is willing to have these elections, but the decision to have these elections is to be made by them, because it is not possible to impose the elections on them. So even if we are dealing with a very wealthy or poor country, the functioning of the democratic system is something internal, not external. We can only give advice, but we should never try to make a decision in lieu of them. Since we are speaking about the Caribbean, would you please say something about Cuba? Well, what I said before. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chile, when the Pope went to Cuba, and I was asked by our northern friends on my opinion, And I said, I think it is so correct. I was pretty upset. And I said, if the US president goes to Cuba, the effect will be greater because the involvement has been pretty successful in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Germany, etc., etc. But don't you do the same with Cuba? Why don't you do the same with Cuba? So I believe the problem, the issue with Cuba, when there is a policy like the embargo policy, it has failed for 50 years. It has been total failure, the embargo, and I think this is the right moment to try something new. Another proposal that I make is, why don't we invite Cuba to sit down with the table with the rest of the presidents, and we're going to be talking, and we're going to see how things change. Worse than the current situation, not possible. Do all Latin American countries want that? If that is what they want, let's do that. Is the Cuban regime going to be transformed overnight? No, but there are going to be limits to the things that are happening within Cuba and within the frame of the embargo. We need to have this in mind. I really would like to ask for a big round of applause for our General Secretary of the Organization of American States. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.